For thousands of years, humans have looked up at the sky during an eclipse and felt something difficult to explain. Not pure fear, not excitement, but a deep, quiet awareness. Because when the sky darkens in the middle of the day, the world pauses for a moment. Birds stop singing, shadows stretch across the ground, the air feels different, and something inside you instinctively pays attention. Ancient civilizations believed eclipses were not random events. They believed these rare moments were signals from the universe, moments when something unseen was shifting behind the scenes. Kings paused at wars. Priests performed sacred rituals. Villages gathered together and watched the sky in silence, not because they believed the eclipse would destroy the world, but because they believed it revealed something people had been ignoring. And even today, something fascinating happens after every eclipse. People begin noticing things they couldn't see clearly before. Old habits that once felt normal suddenly feel heavy. Certain relationships start to feel different. Thoughts you pushed away for months begin rising back to the surface. Questions appear in your mind that you can no longer easily dismiss. It's almost as if the eclipse acts like a cosmic mirror, reflecting the parts of your life that are no longer aligned with who you are becoming. And what that mirror reveals is often simple but powerful. Something in your life is ready to change. But here's the part most people misunderstand. The real shift rarely happens during the eclipse itself. It happens right after the shadow passes. That's why the next 24 to 48 hours, March 4th and March 5th, can feel unusually powerful. During this window, your mind becomes clearer than usual. Patterns begin to stand out. Situations you once tolerated start to look different. And sometimes, in a quiet moment, you suddenly realize that something has been holding you back for far longer than you realized. But during this period, many people make the same mistake. Instead of releasing what no longer belongs in their lives, they hold on to it even tighter. And that is exactly what you should avoid doing right now. When clarity arrives, it rarely feels comfortable. In movies and books, clarity is often shown as a beautiful moment, a sudden realization followed by relief, confidence, and immediate direction. But in real life, clarity often arrives quietly. And when it does, it can feel unsettling. Because clarity doesn't just highlight the good parts of your life. It reveals the truth. And truth has a strange way of exposing the things we've been avoiding. Sometimes it shows you habits that slowly drain your energy, habits that once felt harmless, scrolling late into the night, procrastinating important decisions, staying busy with distractions instead of moving forward. At first, these behaviors feel normal, comfortable even. But when clarity appears, they start to look different. Suddenly, they don't feel like comfort anymore. They feel like weight. Other times, clarity reveals routines that quietly keep you stuck. You wake up. You follow the same schedule. You move through the same tasks. You repeat the same conversations, day after day. And for a long time, nothing about it feels wrong. But then something shifts. You begin to notice that the routine isn't moving you forward anymore. It's simply repeating yesterday. And that realization can be deeply uncomfortable because routines are familiar. They create the illusion of stability. Breaking them requires courage. Then there are the moments when clarity reveals something even harder to accept. Relationships. Not every relationship in life is meant to last forever. Some people enter your life to teach you something. Some appear during a specific phase of your journey. And some slowly drift out of alignment with who you are becoming. But the mind often resists seeing this. Because letting go of relationships can feel painful. It can create uncertainty. It can raise questions we don't want to answer. So instead of facing the truth, many people ignore the small signals. The conversations that feel draining. The silence that feels heavier than it used to. The subtle sense that something has changed. For weeks, sometimes months. The mind pushes these signals away. You tell yourself everything is fine. You focus on other things. You convince yourself that the feeling will pass. But after an eclipse, something interesting tends to happen. Your brain begins connecting dots. Patterns that once seemed unrelated suddenly form a clear picture. Moments from the past suddenly make more sense. Things people said months ago replay in your mind with new meaning. Events that once felt random begin to reveal a pattern, and with that pattern comes clarity. You start understanding the source of your exhaustion. You realize why certain situations have been frustrating you. You begin to see why something in your life feels slightly misaligned. The feeling that something isn't quite right becomes harder to ignore. And this is where many people reach an emotional crossroads, because awareness creates a decision point. Once you see something clearly, you can't truly go back to the way things were before. You may try, but the awareness remains. And this is where many people make a critical mistake. Instead of exploring the realization, they push it away. The mind looks for distractions. It opens social media. It fills every quiet moment with noise, videos, scrolling, endless information. Anything that prevents you from sitting with the realization for too long. Sometimes people even convince themselves that the feeling is meaningless. They say things like, maybe I'm just tired. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe this feeling will disappear tomorrow. And sometimes it does fade temporarily, but the awareness doesn't truly vanish, because once your mind recognizes a pattern, it remembers it. The realization becomes part of your perspective. Even if you ignore it for a while, deep down, a quiet voice keeps reminding you. Something has shifted. Something inside you has changed. And once awareness appears, it rarely disappears completely. This is why moments of clarity can feel uncomfortable. Not because something bad has happened, but because clarity often arrives before action. It shows you the truth before you are fully ready to respond to it. It's like standing at the edge of a doorway. Behind you is the familiar past. Ahead of you is something unknown. And for a moment you stand between the two, not quite ready to move forward, but no longer able to fully return to the old path. This emotional space can feel confusing. You may feel restless. You may feel unusually reflective. You may notice your mind revisiting certain questions again and again. And during the days following an eclipse, these feelings can intensify. Because eclipses have always symbolized transitions. The temporary disappearance of light reminds us that cycles exist everywhere. Day becomes night. Winter becomes spring. Old chapters close so new ones can begin. But transitions are rarely smooth. They often begin with awareness, and awareness often brings discomfort. Not because life is falling apart, but because life is reorganizing itself. This is why it's important to understand something about eclipses. They don't create problems. They reveal them. The challenges in your life didn't suddenly appear because of an eclipse. They were already there, quietly building beneath the surface. The eclipse simply acts like a spotlight. It shines light on things that were hidden in the background. And once that light appears, you have a choice. You can ignore the message. You can push the realization away and return to the familiar routine. Many people choose this path because it feels safer. But there is another option. You can grow because of the realization. You can use the clarity as a guide, not as a source of fear, but as information, a signal that something in your life may be ready to evolve. And evolution doesn't always require dramatic action. Sometimes it begins with simple awareness, recognizing what drains your energy, recognizing what no longer aligns with your direction, recognizing what deserves more attention. When you allow yourself to observe these signals without panic, something interesting happens. The discomfort slowly transforms into understanding, and understanding eventually becomes direction. But during the 48 hours after an eclipse, March 4th and March 5th, there is something extremely important you should avoid doing, a mistake that many people make without realizing it. During moments of heightened awareness, emotions can become stronger, thoughts can feel urgent. And when urgency combines with emotion, people often make decisions they later regret. They react too quickly. They say things they didn't fully mean. They take sudden actions before fully understanding what the realization was trying to show them. And that is why the most important thing during this time is not action. It is observation. Allow the clarity to settle. Allow the patterns to become clearer. Allow your mind time to process what it is recognizing. Because clarity is like sunlight after a storm. At first it feels intense, But if you give it time, it illuminates the landscape of your life in ways you may have never seen before. And once that landscape becomes clear, you will begin to understand exactly what needs to change. But there is one specific mistake almost everyone makes during March 4th to 5th, and avoiding that mistake could make all the difference. During the 48 hours after an eclipse, something subtle begins happening inside the mind. Emotions can feel stronger than usual. Thoughts seem louder. Certain realizations suddenly feel urgent. It's almost as if your mind is trying to process weeks or even months of unspoken thoughts all at once. You may notice yourself reflecting more deeply than usual. Small situations suddenly feel meaningful. Conversations replay in your mind. Memories surface. Questions appear that you hadn't considered before, and with this increased awareness often comes a strong desire to do something immediately, to fix the situation, to respond to the realization, to take action right away. But this is exactly where many people make a mistake, because during the 48 hours after an eclipse, clarity and emotion often arrive together. And when those two forces combine, they can create a powerful but temporary sense of urgency. Everything feels important. Everything feels like it needs to be solved right now, but the truth is the mind is still processing. It is still sorting information. It is still connecting the deeper patterns that the eclipse moment brought to the surface. This is why the most important thing you should not do on March 4th to 5th is make impulsive decisions. Don't send that emotional message you've been thinking about. Don't suddenly quit something out of frustration. Don't confront someone in the heat of the moment. And don't force major life decisions before your thoughts have fully settled. Because what feels like certainty in an emotional moment can sometimes be temporary intensity. When the mind receives new awareness, it needs time to understand it. Just like your eyes need a moment to adjust when moving from darkness into light. The same thing happens mentally. Clarity appears, but your mind needs space to process what that clarity actually means. If you rush into action too quickly, you may react to the emotion rather than the insight. And those are two very different things. Instead of reacting immediately, do something much more powerful. Observe. Observation may sound passive, but in reality it is one of the most powerful forms of awareness. During these next 2 days, simply watch your thoughts. Notice what your mind keeps returning to. Notice which situations suddenly feel heavier than they did before. Notice what drains your energy the moment you think about it. Sometimes the signals will be obvious. You may recognize a habit that no longer feels healthy, a routine that feels stagnant, a pattern that has quietly been repeating in your life. Other times the signal may be more subtle, a feeling of restlessness, a quiet sense that something in your life is out of alignment. A small inner voice telling you that a certain chapter is coming to an end. These signals are important. They are clues. Clues about what your life is slowly preparing to release. But here's something many people misunderstand. Letting go does not always mean removing something immediately. Sometimes it means changing your relationship with it. For example, it might not be about removing a person from your life completely. Instead, it might mean changing how much emotional energy you invest in that relationship. It might mean setting healthier boundaries, protecting your time, or simply choosing not to carry certain emotional burdens anymore. Other times, the thing that needs to be released isn't external at all. It's internal. A belief you've been carrying for years. A fear that quietly influences your decisions. A version of yourself that once protected you but no longer serves your growth. People often hold on to these identities without realizing it. Maybe you once believed you weren't capable of something bigger. Maybe you accepted limitations that were never truly yours. Maybe you shaped your life around expectations that no longer feel meaningful. And when awareness arrives, you begin to realize something important. You've outgrown certain versions of yourself. This realization can feel strange at first, because identity is powerful. It shapes how we see ourselves and how we move through the world. But growth often requires leaving parts of the old identity behind. Not because they were wrong, but because they were designed for a different chapter of your life. And eclipse moments often highlight exactly this kind of transition. They illuminate the gap between who you were and who you are becoming. But again, this realization does not require immediate dramatic action. Sometimes the most powerful shift begins quietly. It begins with awareness. It begins with choosing to stop feeding certain patterns with your attention. Energy is one of the most valuable resources you have. Where you direct your attention, your life slowly grows. And when you reduce the energy you give to something, its influence naturally begins to fade. This is why letting go can be subtle. You may not remove something from your life overnight. Instead, you simply stop investing as much energy into it. And once that shift begins, something remarkable happens. Your life slowly reorganizes around the new direction of your attention. Situations change. Opportunities appear. Different conversations begin. New ideas enter your mind. Because when energy shifts, reality gradually adjusts with it. And this is what makes eclipse moments so fascinating. They don't just reveal what is ready to leave your life, they also reveal what deserves your energy next. During these reflective moments, you may begin noticing something new pulling your attention, an idea you keep thinking about, a direction that feels quietly exciting, a curiosity that keeps returning to your mind. These signals are just as important as the things that feel heavy, because life rarely removes something without opening space for something new. The eclipse closes certain cycles, but it also begins others. And if you allow yourself to observe rather than react during March 4th to 5th, you give your mind the space it needs to understand both sides of that shift. What is ending and what is quietly beginning? Because sometimes the most important realization isn't what you need to let go of. It's what your life is gently guiding you toward next. Think of an eclipse as a reset button for perspective. For a brief moment, something extraordinary happens in the sky. Daylight fades, shadows stretch in unusual ways. The familiar rhythm of the day pauses, and the world feels slightly different. And in that strange stillness, the sky quietly reminds you of something profound. Even the largest things in life move in cycles. Light disappears, then it returns. Darkness arrives, then it passes. Nothing in nature remains frozen forever. Everything moves through phases, beginnings, growth, endings, and renewal. And during the temporary darkness of an eclipse, your mind becomes unusually quiet. When the normal rhythm of the world pauses, your thoughts slow down just enough for you to notice things that are usually hidden beneath the noise of everyday life. You begin seeing patterns. You begin noticing feelings that have been sitting quietly in the background. You begin asking questions that your busy schedule normally prevents you from asking. And sometimes during this quiet moment, a realization appears. Maybe you suddenly recognize that you've been living on autopilot. You wake up at the same time every morning. You move through the same routine. You repeat the same conversations, day after day, week after week. For a long time, nothing about it seems unusual. But during moments of reflection, especially after something symbolic like an eclipse, you may suddenly see that routine from a different perspective. You may realize that you've been moving forward in motion, but not necessarily in direction. Your life has been active, but not evolving. This realization can be surprising, because routines often feel safe. They create the illusion that everything is stable and predictable, but growth rarely happens inside complete predictability. Growth requires change, and change often begins with awareness. Other times, the eclipse reveals something even more subtle. You might recognize that something you once wanted deeply no longer feels meaningful. Maybe it was a goal you pursued for years. Maybe it was a lifestyle you believed would make you happy. Maybe it was an identity you built your life around. But somewhere along the way, you changed. Your experiences shaped you. Your priorities shifted. Your perspective evolved. And now the thing that once excited you doesn't carry the same emotional weight anymore. This can feel confusing, because when we commit to something for a long time, we assume it will always remain important to us. But the truth is, people grow. And as people grow, their desires change. What mattered 5 years ago may not matter in the same way today. The eclipse simply brings that realization to the surface. It shines light on the quiet evolution that has already been happening inside you. And sometimes the message is even more exciting than that. Instead of revealing something that needs to end, the eclipse might awaken something new. You may suddenly feel drawn toward a new direction, a new idea, a new curiosity, a new possibility you hadn't seriously considered before. This often begins as a small thought, a quiet interest, a subtle pull that keeps returning to your mind. You may try to ignore it at first, but it keeps appearing again and again. That's because the mind has an interesting way of guiding us toward growth. It sends signals through curiosity, through fascination, through the feeling of excitement when imagining something different. And eclipse moments have historically been associated with exactly this type of shift. Across cultures and civilizations, eclipses were seen as symbolic markers of transition. They represented the closing of one cycle and the beginning of another. But here's the interesting part. Endings are rarely the real story. They are simply the doorway. When a chapter of life ends, something else quietly begins forming in its place. Nature works this way constantly. Winter ends and spring begins. Night fades and morning arrives. The old leaves fall so new ones can grow. Cycles don't represent destruction. They represent renewal. And the moment after an eclipse is when that doorway between cycles becomes visible. For a brief window of time, you can see your life from a slightly higher perspective. You can notice which patterns are repeating. You can recognize which directions feel alive and which feel empty. You can sense where your energy naturally wants to go next. The question isn't whether something is shifting in your life. Change is always happening, even when it's subtle. The real question is whether you will notice it. Will you pause long enough to recognize the signals? Or will you rush back into the same routines that kept you from noticing them before? Because the universe rarely forces transformation. It doesn't usually arrive with dramatic announcements. Instead, it sends signals, small realizations, moments of clarity, subtle feelings that something is ready to change. And the eclipse may be one of the loudest natural signals we experience. Not because it magically changes your life overnight, but because it creates a moment where your attention shifts, where your mind pauses, where your awareness expands just enough to see what has been quietly unfolding all along. But there is one final realization about eclipse moments that many people miss. And understanding this final insight may completely change the way you see these moments of transformation. Most people believe that letting go means losing something important. It feels like closing a door, like giving up something that once mattered, like admitting that a part of your life is over. Because of this, many people resist letting go for as long as possible. They hold on to habits, relationships, expectations, and identities long after those things have stopped helping them grow. Not because those things are still right for them, but because releasing them feels uncomfortable. It feels uncertain. But life doesn't actually work the way most people think. Letting go is not about loss. Letting go is about space. And space is where transformation begins. Think about it this way. You cannot write a new chapter in a book if you refuse to turn the page. You cannot move into a new room if your hands are still full of everything from the last one. And you cannot move forward if all of your mental and emotional energy is still tied to something that already belongs in the past. Growth always requires space. Nature works this way constantly. When winter ends, trees release their old leaves. When tides shift, the ocean pulls water away before bringing it back again. When night ends, the sky slowly releases darkness so that morning light can appear. Nothing new can grow without first creating room for it. And the same principle applies to your life. Sometimes the only reason clarity feels uncomfortable is because part of you already understands what needs to change. Deep down, you may have sensed it for months. A quiet feeling that something no longer fits. A subtle awareness that a chapter of your life has already ended emotionally, even if you haven't fully accepted it yet. Your intuition often recognizes these shifts long before your conscious mind does. It whispers through small signals, through restlessness, through the feeling that something in your life has become heavier than it used to be. But most people ignore those whispers. They stay busy. They distract themselves. They continue repeating familiar patterns. Until eventually something happens that brings the awareness fully to the surface. Moments like eclipses have always symbolized that type of awakening. The temporary darkness in the sky creates a pause, a brief moment where the normal rhythm of life slows down, and in that pause, your mind has the opportunity to notice what it has been avoiding. The eclipse doesn't create the realization, it simply shines light on what was already there. It reveals the thoughts and feelings that have been quietly building beneath the surface. And once that awareness appears, something important becomes possible. Choice. You can choose to continue holding on to what feels heavy, or you can begin creating space for something new. But here's the important part. Letting go does not have to be dramatic. It doesn't require sudden decisions or extreme changes. Sometimes letting go begins with something much simpler. Awareness. Acknowledging that something in your life is no longer aligned with who you are becoming. Recognizing that certain patterns have already served their purpose. Understanding that growth sometimes requires leaving old versions of yourself behind. And when that realization finally settles in, something remarkable begins to happen. Your energy starts returning. The mental weight you've been carrying slowly lifts. Your mind feels clearer. Your perspective widens. Suddenly, ideas start appearing that you hadn't considered before. New possibilities begin forming. Opportunities that once felt invisible suddenly become noticeable. Not because the world changed overnight, but because you created space to see them. Energy flows where attention goes. And when your attention is no longer trapped in things that have already ended, it naturally begins flowing toward what comes next. That's why nature runs on cycles. Nothing stays the same forever. Every ending creates the conditions for a new beginning. Every closed chapter creates room for another story to start. And sometimes the darkest moment in the sky is simply the beginning of a brighter phase in your life. The eclipse passes. The light slowly returns. The sky becomes normal again, but something inside you may have shifted during that moment of darkness. Your perspective may have changed. Your awareness may have expanded. You may begin seeing your life with a little more clarity than before. And the truth is, after witnessing a moment like that, the person looking at the sky is never quite the same again.